Olga, I am very pleased to be here with you in your studio. On the way here, I was reading that you were born on the eve of the Chernobyl disaster, which really, that was like a massive bell ringing for somebody whose work is so invested in kind of exploring Earth and the legacy of damage in the soil and plants and human trauma. Tell me, did that whole incident overshadow your life, do you feel?
Yeah, I think it's such an interesting question for me because I think about it quite a lot. And I think like conceptually it's so interesting that you're born, which is already such a cathartic event, and then this huge cathartic event follows straight afterwards. And I think in my family history it was often the case that these like births and like these huge historical events were very closely connected to each other. And the interesting thing about Chernobyl is, of course, like I grew up in the 90s in Russia when the whole truth of Chernobyl started to come out because, yeah, for years it was like a big taboo subject. No one really spoke about it. Like some people heard something. But as a child, like on the day of my birthday, there would often be TV shows where like the truth of Chernobyl was revealed. And I like built a very particular connection to this event because of course I felt it's my birthday, but then everyone is talking about that. And it's like, I have very strange like emotional connection to this event, and I think about it quite a lot, what it means to be born before such a huge catastrophe, because Chernobyl was of course environmental catastrophe, but they say it kind of jump-started the end of the Soviet Union because what followed afterwards, like, but also it's very interesting because it's the event that is very shrouded in silence, and the silence around it was like also such an important part of this catastrophe that no one was allowed to talk about it, like the truth was hidden from the people.
When did you start working with soil? When did that become the kind of main material, I guess?
So I think the way I work is I often like do a project and then I think about it and then I keep coming back to it. So the first time I started to think about the soil was in 2019. I had a solo exhibition in Birmingham in the institution called Centrala, and this was like my first time thinking about my family history because I'm born in the Urals. I was raised by my mom, and then she was raised by her mom, and her mom was raised by her mom, so there was no man in the family. And I started to think, like, how did that happen? That there was these three single women, three single mothers, they all lived together in one apartment. And then this, like, research took me geographically, mentally, to all these very dark corners, let's say, of Soviet history, because my great-grandmother was married to a German man who was, during the Stalinist purges, executed on the charges that he was a foreigner. And my great-grandmother ended up being sent to Kazakhstan to the Gulag camp for wives of traitors to the motherland. That's what they called this place. And I started to really think how this history is not really written in history books, especially recently it's being like not mentioned at all. Stalin is suddenly like a good general, and the whole Gulag project is very justified in contemporary Russian politics, which makes sense because, you know, it's kind of repeating itself. And I started to think how soil and plants are really sometimes like the only witnesses. And I really like this idea of one of my favorite artists, Bracha Ettinger, who writes witness as witness. So it's like kind of experience something together with humans and being a witness. And I started to think how soil often is the only record which is truthful that remains, and you cannot alter a record of the soil. My paintings are part of the thinking process. So the painting happens, it comes together, but the process of making it is very important to what it is in the end. And I have been inventing the process of making works, which is kind of about almost removing my own agency and bringing the materials and the plants and the soil and giving them the agency within the work. And I really like this idea of interconnectedness and almost enmeshing of things. So in the works, I use camera-less photography, which is a way of making a trace of an object without the use of camera. So it's one of the first photographic techniques, just using light and photoemulsion. And when I think of cameras, they're so connected to this like colonizing gaze for me, and I almost like try to remove it from my work. That's why when you look at the works, everything is kind of happening at the same time, and you see the traces of plants, you see the traces of my own hand. Sometimes you see my own hand, my own body parts, but then they don't really have a hierarchy. Like, I'm really thinking a lot now about this perception of background, foreground, and how the human was always like on the foreground and the landscape is this like background, which is, I think, the mentality that got us into a lot of trouble. So in the works, I'm trying to enmesh these things, and you cannot really tell what is the background, what is the foreground. Things are kind of like melting onto each other, and the materiality really becomes its own like presence and characters.
They evoke for me ancient parchment or shrouds. So there's this sense of familiarity when you look at them, this kind of, you know, an ancient kind of archetype being evoked. But then there's the unnatural elements that you're mixing in. It is that wonderful mix of natural and unnatural elements. Is that a conscious process, or is it very instinctive?
Because I use layering, and you can see through the layers. You can, like, people get this sense of time, that they can see something that happened before in the painting and they see what came later, and it gives them this sense that the work is maybe older than it is. So it's like very interesting play of things that's happening, which I can control only to a degree as well. I never really know what the work will look like until it's finished.
You've had some fantastic residency experiences. You were at Studio Voltaire, where the Friendship Garden was the show that resulted, and Weissing, and all of these iconic places that are known for really supporting artists. How do you feel that process has moved your work along, just taking yourself out of your everyday environment, out of this fantastic studio even?
I think it's very important to get out of the studio. And also, the residencies are amazing to talk about these things. Also, working with these very different histories, I feel like I really need to find ways to contextualize what I do. The Friendship Garden, I think, was probably one of the most important projects I've done recently. It's a 2-year project. It started before the full-scale invasion, and Studio Voltaire, again, kind of helped to bring the project together and to really like contextualize it again, like place it in London. It really changed the way I work, and I did 2 long trips as part of this research. So I went back to the Urals. It was exactly 1 year before the full-scale invasion started. And it was 20 years since I've been to the place where I was born, so it was very, very different experience to look at it from different perspective. And then the following year, I went to Kazakhstan for a month, and I did a big trip around Kazakhstan with my mom. And we went to the site where the Gulag camp was located, and then we went to this nuclear testing ground. So I think it was about going on physical journeys, but also when you go on, because I only travel by train and the distances are very like enormous. So you're sometimes on the train for like a few days. And I think it's also like part of this thinking process and reflecting, and yeah, it's like traveling mentally and physically is very important, and also seeing different materials.
And yet the show was all about exploring alternative economic systems based on friendship and cooperation and care across communities. and diaspora and generations, which sounds incredibly, like an incredibly optimistic and nourishing thing to come out of such a deep dive into generational trauma.
Yeah, because I think you can really go to very dark places with these histories, and I go there, but I feel like what these women did, for example, and how they came together is just incredible. And if we can get something out of it for today's situation, because I made a film about the garden in the Gulag, and the film starts with the words, before the catastrophe, I traveled in time. And what I was talking about is actually the catastrophe of the invasion, because part of the film was made before and part of the film was made after it was happening. So I think if we can use art in some way to just show us how to resist this, how to come together, then yeah, I think it's beautiful to think about it.
And you were sharing histories of gardening kind of as a radical act of care, of survival, and women cooperating with each other as gardeners to feed, their communities.
Even though it's like a simple act in a way, but it can be radical, and actually anything can be resistance, anything can be a radical act as long as the intention is there, and as long as it breaks this pattern of this just like violence and extraction and everything that is so problematic back then, that is still like never really went away.
I find myself intrigued by the idea of what state of mind you might be in when you're making these paintings with all of these associations, both positive and negative. Is there a sort of ideal atmosphere that you feel kind of inspired and motivated by?
I think what is interesting about these works for me is they're very dispersed in time, and it's because they're really layered, and I use so many different, I bring in so many different elements, and each of them have their own timeline, their own story. So for example, I make imprints of plants in the dark room, so that's like one day being in the dark with the plants and my own body, quite performative almost. Then there is this other time when I make all the paints, and it's the opposite. I need the light, and I see how the light reflects and all this. And then there is this moment where I bring all these elements together and make the work, and I need to do it. I always have 8 hours to do it, because I realize that's the ideal time before the paint starts drying, and because I overlay things, I cannot have the layers too dry because I really like them interacting with each other. So there is this moment where I just from the morning till the evening just put all these things together, and I never really know how it will come out until it's done. I like to think about it as almost a choreography, because I feel now I know the process and I know which steps to take, but also I kind of like the dispersion of it. I kind of like that it allows all these different timelines to come together.
I believe you've got a different body of work, continuing on show in Cromwell Place, that was also somewhat inspired by a residency in Hong Kong.
Yeah.
Which, again, the sunlight, you said, was one of the ingredients you wanted to work with, because it's completely different experience of light there.
Yeah, it was a very beautiful experience, because as my work is still so rooted in my own history, my own geography, this was a way to go completely out of it. And sometimes this moment when you strip yourself of all your comfort ingredients, it really makes you think what is at the essence of the work, what is one element I could not get rid of. Because when I came to Hong Kong, I didn't bring on purpose any of my pigments, any of that, because I really wanted to see what will happen, what will I need to find, what will I need to make the work happen there. And then I realized how light is actually one element the work cannot exist without. And I'm very interested in, how the light enters these paintings, because of course, on the superficial levels, it's about the colors and but also the cameraless processes that allow these imprints to enter the work, and also thinking how in this like orthodox spirituality, this golden paint and the use of gold leaf, it was in fact to create this like shine, this light, this reflection of light, which is associated by these spiritual powers. So it's very interesting, and I was experimenting a lot with cyanotypes, which is cameraless photographic technique, which is like at the foundation of photography. And in London, of course, the sunlight is not in such abundance as in Hong Kong. So I was really experimenting a lot with it and with exposures, and also making imprints of plants and objects, but also of my own mark. So I was like painting on transparencies and then exposing it onto paper using sunlight. So it's kind of like, again, the connection of my own hand and the hand of light.
You told me when we met at the Open Studios that you'd worked on silk as well, on antique silk.
Yeah, it was very interesting for me because I was given these 2 pieces of silk, which were used to make dresses long time ago, and one of them is very interesting because it's a silk dyed with mud. So immediately I was really fascinated by it because of a connection to the soil, but also to women's bodies, because they would wear these mud-dyed silk dresses and the mud would like rub off on their bodies sometimes. And it's like very, very interesting connection if you think about it, to dress like in soil essentially. And I was making small works with this material because I never work on silk, so that was like very new for me. And I was connecting it to cyanotypes. I was making cyanotypes on silk, and because it's this brown, muddy color, the lines are almost invisible, which is also very interesting because you really have to look at it to see what's happening.
I'd never heard of mud-dyed silk.
Yeah, it's really fascinating, and it's very beautiful, and it kind of sounds very basic, because they would just put kind of water in the ground, mix the mud, put the silk in. So it's kind of like very simple, but the result is just stunning. And
but then to wear it with the mud still on it.
Exactly, right? It's fascinating because, yeah, it's like you cannot really think of a closer connection to the land when actually like wearing something that was dyed with mud. It's really fascinating. But also, I was exploring lots of other dyeing processes there, like dyeing with different plants. This is something that I'm definitely going to explore more in the future as well. I think the work is still developing so much. It's still like, I'm still learning my own process, and I'm still always discovering the new step for it. And I think since I came back, I really became more and more fascinated with like materiality. I really, in Hong Kong, I also met people who do traditional, it's called tanka painting. So it's a painting done with mineral pigments. And I was talking a lot about like the spirituality behind the minerals, but from totally different cultural perspective. So I really came back with this, I guess, hunger to push the materiality forward, and the new works, they're very much informed by it. Like, I now stick the pigments onto the linen. It's like they really kind of become very present in the work. And then the lines and the imprints come in contact with this materiality, but they also kind of get a bit destroyed by it. So the painting has this tension where almost just when you think you see the image appearing, it kind of immediately gets disrupted by the very materials that are supposed to make it present. And I'm just very interested with this tension, how I can maintain it in the work, where I can push it further. I'm thinking to push the scale of my works, because I always liked that the works are scaled like me. They are kind of my height, my size. But now I'm thinking maybe I'm ready to see how big they can grow and how they can kind of outgrow my own body, which is kind of very different from Hong Kong because I was making very small works, very intimate scale works.
But you've also made a film, haven't you? Was that part of Friendship Garden?
So yeah, so making films has always been a part of the practice, and the Friendship Garden film is actually very different from all the other films I made because it's first time I'm working with 8mm. And on one hand, it's also informed by this desire to let go of the camera, even though to make a film maybe you don't need a camera, but definitely camera is a big part of making films. But I wanted to find a way to film which would be more connected to the materiality of painting, so more fragile way, I guess, of making. So I found 8mm camera, and of course it's again a way to interact with light. It's a physical film inside the camera. It's very hard to control. It's not like filming digitally because you cannot see what you filmed, and a lot of the editing for the film was done in camera, and the kind of gaps in the narrative are often the actual gaps in time. So I would film one day, then not film for 2 days, and then what you see is a cut in the, like you go from a forest, say, to a lake, but then between these two shots, there might have been a span of few days. So it's like very interesting to think how this analog way of making films can really enable it, these kind of absences that when you watch a film which is quite fragmented, they become like very present, these absences, and you do start to think what was happening between the different takes and shots. So it was a very nice process because it connected the film to the paintings, when I always thought maybe they have been a bit separated in my practice, but I cannot stop making one or the other. I just cannot be like, no, that's it. Now I'm just making paintings. I go through periods. Now, for example, for the next few months, I'm probably just gonna make paintings, but I'm already thinking about the next film, so I know it's gonna like come in soon. Yeah.